All right, everybody. Well, again, my name is Warren Rayburn, for those of you that have just joined, and thank you again for doing so. We're going to kick off the last of the five-part series that we've developed, diving into the cloud. So this last piece involves the cost-effective nature of cloud computing, and what we're going to try to illuminate for everybody here today is the various considerations that go into making that evaluation for your business. So we're going to talk along the lines of size and scale, and now that's going to, project into these considerations. Certainly, when you're talking about an SMB space versus an enterprise space, the models and the considerations change. So we're going to try to, again, include some of that detail for you here today so you can walk away from this discussion with those items and the material that you're really going to have a conversation about at the end of the day if this is something you're considering doing, again, even partially in a hybrid environment, or for some of your services and/or needs, or for the as-a-service models that we've gone through in some of the previous editions of this series. So again, I want to welcome everybody. My name is Warren Rayburn. I serve as the Executive Vice President here at Line Systems, and I've also been the moderator for the previous 4 editions in the series. So I want to welcome everybody back, and those of you that are joining us for the first time. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the outline for the material that I just mentioned a moment ago as to the considerations involved here. Just want to direct everybody's attention to that top left portion of the slide. We've done a considerable amount of research in building this material, from consulting Gartner studies, Forrester research studies, the Poneman Institute, and even our partner Sophos, for that matter, on the hardware and the cloud security elements. So some of the material that you'll see here today in this part of the presentation has been derived from any one of those sources. But in particular, 84% of CIOs report that they have cut application costs by moving to the cloud. So, again, the goal here being that we want to show you some statistical detail as to the financial benefits or disadvantages, because again, like I said, depending on your part of the marketplace, you can make arguments in either direction in many cases. So is cloud computing really cost effective? So the considerations we listed here for everybody include the hardware elements. So that's going to be anything from a storage area network, your virtual machines, or even the hardware itself in a traditional environment from your routers, switches, etc. Software. So the software as a service model that we discussed previously. We're going to go through some of the pros and cons and the associated costs here today. Support and maintenance, again, defining what your need is in that space and the level of control that you wish to maintain and what that costs you. IT personnel, so let's talk about the actual hard dollars associated with employment considerations and otherwise. Costs and factors to consider, some general material that we fell outside of the borders of the first 4 that we've defined here today. And we'll render those as well. And then lastly, we're going to just run through a quick cost-benefit analysis that we developed just for example purposes and combining all this material in a case study. So as I mentioned, the first portion of this that we're going to cover is the hardware element. And in general, and I want to focus here on the public cloud elements, for these examples in particular. But in general, public cloud solutions do not require the outright purchase of server hardware or elements, network storage, so those storage area networks, your backup systems. So again, whereby you're outfitting your local environment, perhaps if you're hosting today at one of your corporate locations in a hub and spoke environment, those backup systems are going to be inherent to a public cloud environment from a subscription perspective. Disaster recovery systems. Important to note in the public cloud space, and for that matter, any cloud environment, the disaster recovery goes through a variety of options, and we went through this in one of the previous editions of the series. But certainly disaster recovery is not just isolated to the physical hardware, as we're discussing here, but you want to keep in mind and just make a note for yourself that the DR side of this also pertains to, you're also looking at heating and cooling elements like we're going to talk about here in this next portion of it, but also your WAN link side. So how you're actually traversing the internet to get to your particular data center partner. So again, do you have redundancy in the field from a copper, coax, or fiber perspective? Do you have redundant elements as it pertains to the edge devices involved? You want to eliminate as many single points of failure as you can. So take that hardware mentality internally or what you're trying to develop in the public cloud space with your data center provider, and also want to ensure that that's pervasive in each element of your thought process as it pertains to the transaction of that data. Power and cooling systems, again, with partnering on the data center side, and this being the crux of their business, obviously, you're looking at large-scale leaper battery systems, potential dual power feeds, duplicate grid or redundant grid feeds within the electrical space, the cost associated with those heating and cooling elements, and also just the physical space that we talk about here in this next point with utility costs or data center costs. Again, you're offsetting the demands that you place on your local environment into a much greater size facility. So, your cost on that and the maintenance and the upkeep associated with that are going to diminish as a result of being a buyer in that environment as opposed to the sole proprietor of those services locally. The next slide here discusses the efficiencies when it pertains to security monitoring of the local area network that are encouraged by going to address the hardware portions of your environment through a cloud-based arrangement. So the potential there to increase the life of your PCs, of your other devices, by mitigating some of the risk factors in the hardware environment from an infiltration standpoint, placement of malware and other such material into your environment to potentially compromise the hardware itself, and not just isolated to PCs, but you want to also talk about any servers. Any of you that have been exposed to a cyber attack quickly can appreciate the potential risk there to the hardware elements involved all the way through your network. You're going to decrease your depreciation costs as well. So again, your situation whereby that investment isn't, the investment not being so capex intensive, you're certainly going to you're going to decrease your depreciation costs and considerations there as a result. And then slow the technology obsolescence consideration. From a hardware perspective, when you go into a cloud environment, one of the cost-effective arguments is the fact that you're not required to upgrade the hardware with the rapidity that you would possibly while housing this and hosting this locally. You're going to be able to take advantage of the different farms that the data center provider has available, the virtualization elements of what the data center provider brings to the table, and therefore addressing any type of technology stagnation that oftentimes results when you make that investment on the CapEx side and then are hosting locally. That's certainly something you want to consider. And for many, of our smaller or SMB clients, that's definitely a consideration because, in the OpEx model, you're going to be taking advantage of, some higher-end resources and higher-cost resources at the end of the day that may not be financially feasible otherwise. So this next slide is going to talk about the software piece. And again, with each one of these introductory slides to the topic, subtopics, we've just included some of these statistical elements. So users who move apps to the cloud save on average 21% a year. So again, you're decreasing your reliance on local hardware elements. You're decreasing reliance on potentially local developers, potentially software resources that you'd be responsible for maintaining, upgrading, and renewing licenses against as well. So all of those elements come into play when you're talking about potential cost reductions or technology improvement. So automatic software updates, going on to this next slide here, remove the cost of constantly purchasing, running, and maintaining new software updates. You're increasing efficiencies through use of latest version, and you also improve your storage considerations. When you move to the cloud, you're looking at potentially taking advantage of large SAN environments. You're also looking at mitigating the marriage between all these considerations. You're looking at mitigating some of your hardware considerations as well. As you move to a software as a service model, you're taking advantage of virtualization at the provider level. And then lastly, from an expansion perspective, the software as a service component some of the cost that you may attribute to this, as opposed to writing, licenses because you're not interested in making upgrades after 12 months or 24 months or what have you. The interesting thing is in our research we found that a lot of firms are offsetting some of the costs associated with SaaS or software as a service by addressing revenue increases or revenue attainment through the expansion of the business and addressing perhaps cultural or demographic obstacles. So one particular case study we looked at involved a French cosmetics firm that wanted to expand their market into the Chinese space and frankly didn't have the resources to address that. So they engaged a software as a service provider, went into the Chinese market, saw a tremendous amount of growth in the immediate sense, which invariably offset the SaaS costs, and the ROI on it was less than 3 months. So they were able to overcome the development challenges that are addressed through language barriers, cultural barriers, frankly, for that matter, setting up and maintaining a data center in China, getting things through customs and the hassles that can potentially come with that, staffing considerations, management considerations. So by partnering with an SaaS firm located in China with a global presence for that matter, they had already undertaken the costs and all of those other considerations and addressed those, and now you're just able to take advantage of that in a subscription model. So it's certainly something to consider there. Again, lastly, that cost being offset by revenue generation depending on the model that you're in. From a retail perspective, certainly something that could be of advantage to you. So next, wanted to discuss the support and maintenance considerations here. In a typical public cloud environment, the cloud provider is responsible for the monitoring, maintenance, and upgrade of all hosted programs, hardware, access, and all of the respective physical elements that we discussed a moment ago, heating, cooling, etc. Stores the data. So again, that's a situation whereby you're going to increase the capabilities you have within your storage area networks, your SAN environments, just by taking, the partnership down the line. Frankly, again, as I mentioned, these are much larger organizations with, sometimes as much as 200,000 square feet dedicated to a data center in the enterprise space. You can sublet a cage, in that environment, et cetera. But, ultimately in a public space, as opposed to a private environment, which I just alluded to with a cage lease, in the public space, you're now taking advantage of that buying power I alluded to with a greater number of subscribers in a virtual environment and the consolidation and compression that takes place therein. Run the data center provider, the cloud provider, runs regular data backups and redundancy, measures. So, again, you're offsetting the demand on your local IT staff and also as well as your hardware infrastructure and resources by allowing that cloud center, the cloud or data center provider to address that on your behalf. Lastly, handles all backup costs and fees. So we talked about that as far as the physical elements are concerned. We talked about the redundant grids on the power side, the enterprise size, battery operations that they're going to incorporate here. But as far as the backup costs, you're looking at redundant internet feeds. You're looking at potentially having the ability to house staff there in the event of an absolute disaster. You lose your space due to a fire or, an act of nature or otherwise. You're going to be able to potentially, depending on the partner, outfit staff with internet access and phone access as well. So some of the staging operations that are available to you. So moving on to this next consideration is IT personnel. And in that space, one of the things that we wanted to highlight here was companies that use the cloud to deploy their applications spend, on average, 25% less on personnel. What more often we found to be the case is that, folks are able to keep the staff that they have in place, but take better advantage of the time and the resources that they do have, by addressing, various hardware maintenance considerations, software licensing and deployment considerations, addressing backups, supporting those backups, et cetera. You oftentimes can maintain or decrease staff based on the fact that somebody is also undertaking those same tasks for you, in a subscription model or otherwise. So moving to the next item that we have here, 62% of companies that are saving IT personnel costs are then in turn reinvesting those savings back into the business, which only makes logical sense, right? So you could increase headcount in other areas, be it sales, operations, from a support perspective, customer-facing material. It could also be reinvested from a wage perspective. But also, lastly, one of the other things that's interesting in coming into contact with clients now more than ever that are looking for these types of needs, it's also looking to drive product and innovation. So allowing, development time and space to potentially, as I alluded to with that last software discussion, looking at this from the perspective of driving additional revenue to offset some of these costs. So we're going to now talk about costs and factors to consider. So server maintenance and storage. So this is more like again, I think in this last few slides here before we get into the cost-benefit analysis, I think it's important to go over just some of the summary material we've discussed in the previous slides. So server maintenance and storage, we talked about the hardware involved with maintaining these environments. All of you that are familiar with supporting such a data center environment locally can attest to the fact that, you have not only the hardware costs, but you have the manpower to support that and the related storage considerations. Some of you may still be indulging in tape backups for that matter. Again, when you're looking at a cloud solution and associated costs, really you're making better investment. You're making better dollars and better investment of those dollars, I should say, by ensuring that this is off-site, readily accessible from any remote location, not only for your telecommuters, but I mentioned that example with the true disaster scenario. We had one end user that lost access to their location for over 2 weeks with their director of IT being overseas at the time. And the biggest thing there was, when they came to us for a solution, not only was the connectivity a consideration, but then also, the fact that they were hosting all their applications, their software needs, production elements, all of that was housed in that singular environment in New Jersey. So we got that off the coast for them. They have daily backups that they're running. They have accessibility to the various programs they need in the event of a disaster, but it also better supports their telecommuters in a BYOD environment, We talked about the IT support element of this and, the consideration when it comes to personnel and the soft and hard costs that come with that consideration as well on the employment side. Software and hardware upgrades. So again, in this subscription model, when you're talking about, a data center provider or a cloud provider, those costs are amortized over the lifetime of that contract. So the CapEx situation and deployment or expenditure, is going to be, again, mitigated somewhat on your behalf. So it's that financing option. Managed network security. And I'm going to get into a couple things that I have here as well that are off the presentation itself. But the managed network security really speaks to some of the considerations when it comes to the overall network and potential cost there. So, for example, the Poneman Institute that I alluded to earlier conducted a survey of 2,000 individuals that held the responsibility of managing the IT security functions for SMB organizations that employed anywhere from 5 employees to 5,000 individuals. So a couple of the takeaways there that I want to relay to everybody. A third of all the respondents admitted that they're not certain if a cyber attack even occurred in the past 12 months. So if you want to talk about costs, we've all heard in the news about Target, Neiman Marcus, so on and so forth. Unfortunately, some of these things, until exposed, frankly, may be costing you dollars and you're unaware of it, or could be addressing resource issues. For example, in our space on the hosted PBX side, if you don't do an adequate job of addressing things from a password protection standpoint, you could receive a phone bill, a month to 2 months out that, includes a group of fraudulent calls. So somebody gets into your network and then can access, hypothetically, the phones, soft client or otherwise. That's certainly something that could, again, while not immediately or readily available from the cold detail perspective, could come back to prove, quite costly. The respondents also estimated the cost of disruption in normal operations was much higher than the cost of theft or IT assets and/or infrastructure considerations. And in that sense, when it came to extrapolating costs related to business disruptions and damages to IT assets, there was an average cost of $670,000 related to incidents pertaining to the IT assets and infrastructure over the last 12 months. Disruption costs are much higher with an extrapolated average of almost $1 million. So take that a step further, and then you want to look at it from the perspective of the size of your business. And that's one of the things in the beginning of this discussion I hinted to, the fact that, you can make an argument from either side of the fence depending on the size of your organization. The per capita cost of damages to IT assets and disruption operations is most felt when we looked at the data with customers between 5 and 100 users, and then from the 100 user to 1,000 threshold. There's about a 50% decline thereafter when you're talking about the next group being 1,000 to 2,500 or 2,501 employees to 5,000. And a lot of that has to do with the personnel items as well. So, you have certainly enhanced monitoring capabilities, you have bigger budgets, you have larger IT staffs, and some of that is even offset, with those larger organizations making investments in the cloud. So something to consider from a small business or small to medium-sized business perspective is ultimately what you have knowledge of, what you have monitoring capabilities of, and what your potential exposure is. Additional costs could result in regulatory considerations like PCI denial. So if you have a situation whereby you're a retail operation and you can't provide PCI compliant related environments, well then you may not be able to process credit card transactions, as many of you are aware of. HIPAA compliance, so if you're talking about EMR transactions and the data sensitivity therein, the healthcare market in particular is extremely concerned with this, from large hospital systems down to private practices and the potential exposure there. I mean, you're not only talking about insurance information and financial information, including banking information being disclosed, but also Social Security information, home address, etc. There's a wealth of information there that ultimately, if exposed, could provide quite an expense to not only you, but your reputation as well. So that's something, again, that you definitely want to keep note of. And I think one of the last things I wanted to touch on was the BYOD environment, mobile devices. So many of us are being confronted with the incorporation of bring your own device environments, from your Android devices, your smartphones, etc. All of that material now being part and parcel of your network. I mean, it's been revolutionary in that sense over the last 2 to 3 years with the adoption of, incorporation of those hardware elements into the local area networks. Also throw in, as I mentioned, the hosted PBX piece and taking your voice to the cloud. Well, now you have soft phone applications that are much more readily available through the public internet than a standard handset ever was, and obviously for a variety of technical reasons. But your exposure points are increased exponentially with BYOD, and thus security continues to be a major consideration. We talked about the disaster recovery piece. So again, from the cost consideration there, I go back to that example I raised with the folks in New Jersey that were literally out of business for 2 weeks. From a DR perspective, now they have that redundant data center in place, and they have a variety of redundancy options in the field to ensure, optimal connectivity. Now, granted, some of that's going to work, when you look at, taking a cable co-connection and a local exchange carrier connection, like Alliance Systems, Verizon, et cetera, Final Mile. But obviously, in the event of a natural disaster, that's not going to get the job done. So ultimately, you want to make sure that you have that information at a redundant data center or with a cloud partner provider who's hosting that material to get accessibility from the telecommuter perspective and the BYOD environments. Lastly, the flexibility and scalability elements to consider. Again, we've talked a great deal about virtualization, in the previous 4 sessions and as well as today, mentioning it on a few occasions. The flexibility and scalability really comes back to the ability to be nimble, the ability to address acquisitions in a rapid fashion, the addition or severance of, employee resources for that matter. Your reaction time improves exponentially, and your ability to, increase or decrease resources is done on a subscription basis as opposed to now being oversubscribed in a particular hardware scenario within your core. So I want to just go into the cost-benefit analysis now. We looked at, an average customer for Line Systems as kind of a nice threshold, but that being 150 employees for a 5-year period, over a 5-year period. And that's another thing when you're looking at this, again, size of organization, but it's a matter of extrapolating the costs over a period of time, and in some cases that's beneficial to an organization and maybe smaller in scope to have that financed and not necessarily look at the long term, whereas some of the larger organizations are okay with the CapEx look and ensuring that their ROI is maybe 3+ years out based on the investment that they're making. So again, it all comes down to your need and size and what's going to provide you with the most output for your dollar, but also addressing those other considerations that I mentioned a moment ago. Some of the smaller entities might be able to get into higher-end hardware environments that they wouldn't be able to finance otherwise in a CapEx environment. Smaller entities might be looking more towards IT staff and supplementing that staff, because of budgetary considerations. The software as a service model, again, being able to address license upgrades, just automatically, as opposed to having to have somebody go through and do so manually and go through the renewal process and the contract management, et cetera. The monitoring elements that come with this as well, being able to do so remotely, being able to manage, add users, subtract users remotely in very rapid fashion, which addresses security and production at the same time. So in the cost-benefit analysis, we looked at the factors that we discussed here today: hardware, software, support infrastructure, and personnel. And what we did was we just broke down a comparable premise-based model with 150 PCs, estimated at $800 per PC, Microsoft Office, email needs, so your Exchange servers, et cetera, your backup costs at $13 a user. We were looking at that from the perspective of accessibility in the Exchange backups and also with the application side of things. 3 servers at $5,000 a server to facilitate this. And then lastly, the support piece. Now, again, you could take away from that, maybe in a 150 user environment, you may be comfortable with half of that IT staff. But the bottom line is you're looking at a fairly significant investment from the hardware side of things, the application and software side, your disaster recovery elements, your infrastructure, and then lastly your personnel. And then what we did was we took it to the cloud for all of those respective items. Your virtual desktop integration, you're looking at the Microsoft 365 Office Suite package, the backup and DR elements accounted for, and then lastly the virtualized environments that would support the servers, and again the personnel being accounted for in that model as well, rounding out to about $80 per user per month. And again, that's just based on 150 employees for a 5-year period. But again, we wanted to show you that despite even making some adjustments in the due diligence process on the premise-based side, regardless, even if you cut that in half, it's still a pretty sizable investment on the front end of things as opposed to what you're looking at there on the cloud. So with that said, I just wanted to put it up into the floor. If anybody had any questions, I'll go ahead and field those now. And wanted to, folks are potentially, looking into, posing some material, just wanted to let you know that each one of the respective series elements is available on the website at www.mindsystems.com, all of which have been recorded and there for your review with the PowerPoint to accompany it. So go ahead and if you have missed some of those previous sessions, please feel free to jump in, take a look, and give us your feedback as well, because we're looking to do something in the webinar series probably starting in September, and maybe doing something in that Q3, Q4 timeframe. So we're open to suggestions if you feel something would be advantageous. Again, the goal here throughout this series has been to provide an objective educational resource for both our customers and our partners. And but again, like I said, with our exposure in the industry, if you feel that perhaps a hosted PBX webinar would be advantageous or disaster recovery, let us know how we can help maybe fill that that knowledge base and that knowledge gap, and we'd be happy to do so. So with that said, I don't see anybody on the question side, so I'll go ahead and wrap things up and let everybody get back to their day. But again, I want to thank everybody for their participation this afternoon and attendance, and any questions, please let us know. Thanks again.